Mike Hawthorne had seen his fair share of oddities during his years as a long-haul trucker, but the night he picked up the hitchhiker on Route 66 was something he'd never be able to forget. It was the dead of summer, but the air on that stretch of highway felt cold, almost unnatural. The only sound was the rumble of the truck's engine and the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. The night was as still as a cemetery, and the stars above looked like distant eyes watching him. Mike had seen this part of the road 1,000 times before, but tonight something felt different, wrong even. He could feel the oppressive silence pressing in on him, a silence that felt like it was alive. Around 2 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, he saw a figure standing by the roadside. A man wrapped in a thick jacket despite the oppressive summer heat, his thumb raised in that universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Mike had learned to ignore such things over the years, but tonight something about the man made him hesitate. "Come on, Mike," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel. "You're not some dumb kid anymore." But despite his better judgment, Mike's foot eased off the gas pedal and he pulled the truck to the side of the road, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The hitchhiker approached the truck slowly, his steps heavy, deliberate. Mike's gut twisted. He couldn't place it. But there was something wrong about this guy. His eyes were too dark, too hollow. They were the kind of eyes you only see on the dead. The man didn't speak a word as he climbed into the passenger seat. Mike shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't quite bring himself to speak. There was a chill in the air now, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel the man's presence, but there was no sound, no rustling of clothes, no breath. It was as though he wasn't really there at all. After what felt like hours of silence, Mike couldn't take it anymore. He glanced over at the hitchhiker, his mouth dry, and asked, "Where are you headed?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a bony finger and pointed out the windshield, far into the distance. Mike followed the direction of the finger, his eyes straining in the dark, until they fixed on an old abandoned building on the horizon. Its silhouette loomed against the night sky, a decaying shell of a place that shouldn't have been standing at all. Mike's heart began to race. "Where?" he whispered under his breath, though he didn't know why. He had a feeling, a deep sense that this place, this building, held some kind of significance. But when he looked back to his passenger, the hitchhiker was gone. The seat next to him was empty. His pulse quickened, and Mike slammed his foot on the brake, pulling over to the side of the road again. He twisted his head frantically, but there was no sign of the man. The air was thick with silence, so thick that it pressed against his eardrums. He turned his head slowly, the hairs on his neck prickling with the weight of something. Something wrong. He caught his breath and looked into the rearview mirror. Nothing. No one. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. That hollow-eyed gaze seemed to pierce through him even now. The hitchhiker hadn't just disappeared, he had vanished. Mike's mind raced as he tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. Maybe it was the isolation of the road, the endless blackness making him imagine things. But deep down, he knew better. He had felt it. Something unexplainable. Something that wasn't natural. The next day, Mike couldn't shake the feeling. He had to know more about that building, the one the hitchhiker had pointed to. So after dropping off his load, he made his way back, hoping to find some sort of clue. He didn't know why, but something told him he needed to. When he reached the building, his breath caught in his throat. It was exactly as it had looked in the dark, abandoned, crumbling, and eerily quiet. There was a plaque on the front, barely legible, but Mike made it out. Site of the 1982 Highway 66 crash, in memory of the lost souls. His blood ran cold. The details were fuzzy, but Mike recalled hearing about a tragic accident many years ago. A crash that had killed several people in the dead of night on that stretch of highway. The name of the hitchhiker came back to him then, a name that had been whispered in stories about the accident. Jared Stevens, a young man who had died in that very building when his truck swerved off the road and collided with a brick wall. Mike turned away from the plaque, his legs weak. He had picked up a ghost, a soul lost to the road, a soul that had pointed him toward his final resting place. He never drove that route again. And every time he thought of that night, the hollow eyes of the hitchhiker haunted him just beyond the darkness, waiting for the next soul to pass by. Jerry Donovan had been on the road for over 10 hours when the fatigue set in. The open highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the backwoods of Maine. The cab of his rig felt like a lonely prison, the hum of the engine the only sound for miles around. He'd been hauling freight for years, and after a decade of road work, he'd become immune to the loneliness. Or so he thought. The small, rural town he'd passed a few miles back seemed like a good place to take a break, so Jerry pulled into a diner on the outskirts of nowhere. The neon sign flickered above him, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, the diner was almost deserted. Just a few truckers slouched over their mugs of coffee. Jerry ordered a greasy burger and fries, then sat by the window watching the rain begin to pour. He could feel the weight of the road in his bones, and the peace of the moment was something he hadn't realized he needed. But when he finished his meal and climbed back into the rig, the feeling hit him. That strange sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Jerry chalked it up to his exhaustion, nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the truck rumbling to life under his hands. But the feeling wouldn't go away. At first, it was just a subtle disturbance, shadows moving in his peripheral vision, flickers of movement that he couldn't explain. His gaze snapped to the side, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark highway stretching out into the rain. He checked the mirrors. The passenger seat was empty. Jerry wiped his brow, the sweat mixing with the chill of the rain-slicked air. He turned on the lights, peering through the windshield at the dark expanse ahead. The road was deserted, as it had been for hours, but every so often in the corner of his vision, there was something, a shifting shape, a vague silhouette that seemed to move just out of the light. He could feel its presence, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. He shook his head, tried to shake the unease out of his mind. "You're just tired," he muttered aloud. "You've been on the road too long. It's nothing." But the unsettling sensation didn't fade. It clung to him like a shadow, always there, always just beyond the reach of the light. He reached over to adjust the radio, trying to drown out the feeling with static, but the presence in the cab only grew stronger. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, eyes wide and searching. His hands tightened on the wheel. Nothing. Nothing but the empty highway. His eyes darted to the passenger seat. It was still empty. But in that brief moment, when his gaze lingered, something shifted. A shadow moved. Just a flicker, a blur. He snapped his eyes away, heart pounding. It had to be his imagination. It had to be. But the feeling lingered, heavy and oppressive, pressing in on him from every direction. It wasn't until he reached the next rest stop that he saw it. Jerry pulled into the lot, the truck's brakes screeching slightly as he parked. He sat there for a moment, his fingers still clutching the wheel. The night was quiet, save for the distant sound of rain drumming on the roof. He reached over to the passenger seat, intending to grab his jacket from the spot he always left it. But when his hand brushed the leather, something stopped him. A cold, damp handprint. The fingers were splayed, pressed against the fabric of the seat like a warning. It was unmistakable. Wet, streaked with something that felt unnatural, like the touch of ice. Jerry recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't seen anyone get in, hadn't heard anything. He had been alone. And yet that handprint, vivid, clear, was there. The seat was empty, but something had been sitting there. Something that left its mark. Something that had been riding with him, unnoticed, through the night. Jerry's heart thudded in his chest, the blood rushing to his head. He grabbed the door handle, pulled it open, and jumped out of the truck, his boots slapping against the wet pavement. He walked around the cab, his hands shaking, looking for some sign, any sign, that would explain what had just happened. But the more he looked, the more he realized that there was no logical explanation. No footprints in the rain. Just the handprint, cold and damp, as if someone or something had been sitting beside him the entire time. He climbed back into the truck, trembling, his mind racing with all the possibilities. He glanced at the mirrors again. The rain had slowed, but the road was still empty. The rest stopped quiet as ever. The feeling didn't go away. The presence, the cold, invisible passenger, it was still there, waiting, watching. And as Jerry drove away into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had ridden with him, whatever had left that handprint, wasn't done with him yet. It was still out there, and it would be waiting for him when he stopped again. It was well past midnight when Lisa pulled her rig into the small, isolated truck stop. The neon sign above the convenience store buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the empty parking lot. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and wet pavement, and a heavy silence hung over the place, as if the world outside had forgotten it even existed. Lisa had been driving for hours and she was exhausted. The road had been deserted for miles, the blacktop stretching on endlessly, and she needed rest, needed to get off the highway for a while. She parked her truck in the far corner of the lot, away from the few other rigs that were scattered around. It wasn't that she minded the solitude. She'd been on the road long enough to become used to it, but there was something about this truck stop that felt off. Maybe it was the emptiness of the place, the way the lights flickered in the store window, or the eerie quiet that seemed to hang over the lot like a fog. But she shook it off. She'd been driving too long, and her body was screaming for a break. Inside the convenience store, the fluorescent lights flickered as Lisa made her way to the counter, grabbing a bottle of water and a bag of chips. As she paid, her eyes caught a man sitting in the far corner, his figure half shrouded in shadow. He was staring at her with unnerving intensity, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving her face. He wasn't looking at her like someone admiring a woman's beauty or even someone lost in thought. No, his gaze was sharp, predatory, like he was studying her, waiting for something. The hairs on the back of Lisa's neck stood up. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening, but she brushed it off as paranoia. She'd been on the road for too long, and fatigue had started to warp her perception. This was nothing. He was just another trucker, probably as tired and worn as she was. She grabbed her things and left, her steps quick and purposeful as she headed back to her truck. The stillness of the parking lot was even more pronounced now that the store door had shut behind her. Lisa could hear the distant hum of her truck's engine as she climbed back into the cab, locking the door behind her. The truck's cabin was familiar, her haven, but even in here, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her like the humidity in the air. She stretched out in the seat, her eyes heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. The thought of the man, his gaze, kept flashing in her mind. She turned on the radio, trying to drown out the unease creeping up her spine, but it did little to soothe her. Then hours later, she woke up to a sound, soft, slow, deliberate. The creak of footsteps on the asphalt outside her truck. Lisa's heart leapt into her throat. She froze, her ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking around her rig. The sound was too close, too deliberate. Someone was out there. Terror crawled through her veins as she slowly pulled herself up in the seat, her hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. A suffocating silence followed, and for a moment, Lisa thought she might be imagining it. Then she heard a soft scraping sound, a metal on metal, like the sharp edge of something dragging across the concrete. Her breath hitched as she leaned toward the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Peering out, she barely dared to breathe. Through the darkness, she saw the figure, the same man from the store, standing next to her truck. This time he was closer, his silhouette barely visible under the pale moonlight. But what really sent her pulse racing was the glint of steel in his hand, a knife. Lisa's mind raced, panic rising in her throat like bile. Her instincts kicked in before her brain could catch up. She yanked the keys from the ignition and started the engine in a panic, her fingers fumbling with the gear shift as she slammed it into reverse. The truck lurched backward, tires screeching against the wet pavement, and she slammed her foot on the gas. Behind her, she could hear the man's footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, as he followed her truck. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare take her eyes off the road as she sped out of the parking lot, her tires tearing up the gravel as she floored it. The sound of her engine drowned out the noise behind her, but the image of the man's face, cold and emotionless, stayed burned in her mind. She didn't stop driving until she reached the next town, where she pulled into a well-lit truck stop. Only then did she allow herself to breathe again, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her heart was still racing, and the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and shaken. The next morning, Lisa went to the truck stop's office to report the incident. The man had been watching her every move, she was sure of it. But when she mentioned the strange occurrence to the clerk, the look on his face changed. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low. "There have been others. Strange things happen here sometimes. People see things, hear things. It's not just you, miss. Something about this place, it draws them in." Lisa frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" The clerk didn't answer right away. He simply glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously to the parking lot outside. "Let's just say this place has a history. A lot of truckers, well, they've disappeared. No one knows where they go or what happens to them, but they don't come back." Lisa's blood ran cold. She didn't need any more details. She'd experienced enough to know that some places weren't meant to be trusted, and this truck stop with its flickering lights and empty lot was one of them. As she climbed back into her truck, she cast one last glance at the parking lot. The man wasn't there, but something told her he wasn't far, just waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to drive into that quiet, lonely place. And this time, Lisa knew she wouldn't be the last. I've been a trucker for longer than I care to admit, driving across the heart of America, carrying everything from food to machinery, from steel to dreams. You'd think that after all these years, I'd have seen everything the road has to offer. The long stretches of highway that seem to go on forever, the ghost towns where not a soul has lived in decades, the truck stops with flickering lights that feel more like a reminder of your own solitude than a place for rest. You get used to it. You get used to the sound of the engine, the hum of the tires on asphalt, the emptiness that stretches out in front of you like some kind of eternal promise. But that night, I learned something new. I learned that you can never be prepared for the things that crawl out of the darkness. Things that, in a strange way, are worse than the things you expect. It started like any other trip, a usual haul through the heart of the Dakotas. The engine was humming, my eyes were heavy, and the clock on the dashboard ticked away the hours, each one slower than the last. I'd been driving for what felt like forever, pushing through the night, eyes glazed over with exhaustion. 16 hours on the road, give or take. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But on this particular night, as the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, something was off. Something about the way the trees loomed in the distance, dark shapes against the night sky, felt wrong, like they were watching me. But that's the thing about driving through the wilderness at night. It makes your mind play tricks on you. Maybe it was the sleep deprivation, the late hour, the constant drone of the engine, but I felt it, the urge to stop. I needed a break. My eyes were dry, my back ached, and I was so tired that I could feel my eyelids getting heavy, despite the cold wind blasting through the cracked window. But there was nowhere to stop. No rest area, no gas station, no diner with a flickering neon sign, just miles and miles of empty road, thick trees pressing in on either side, the darkness devouring everything. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a flash of color in the middle of the road, some weird reflection maybe. But no, it wasn't. It was a dress, a purple dress, lying there in the middle of the highway like it had been dropped by someone in a hurry. I slowed down, squinting at it through the headlights. The dress was old-fashioned, out of place, like something from a time when people still cared about lace and buttons. It didn't make sense. Why would a woman be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in a dress like that? I was too tired to think much of it, so I pushed on, telling myself it was nothing. But as I kept driving, things started to get stranger. I passed a pair of shoes, children's shoes, worn and scuffed, like they had been tossed aside in a panic. Then I saw a pile of clothes, kids' clothes, pants, jackets, shirts, scattered across the road, like someone had dropped them in a rush. My stomach turned. Something wasn't right. My tired brain was starting to click into gear now. It wasn't the kind of thing you see on a normal night. It wasn't just a random collection of items. It looked deliberate. I stopped the truck. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe because the sense of wrongness was gnawing at me. Maybe because my gut was telling me I needed to see it for myself. I stepped out of the truck, the cool air biting at my skin, and walked toward the clothes. I bent down and picked up a jacket, holding it in my hands. It was small, probably for a child, but the fabric was damp, like it had been out in the rain for hours. The smell hit me next, a musty, sour odor, like mildew mixed with something darker. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I shouldn't have been there. I should have just gotten back in the truck, but I didn't. Something made me look around, my eyes scanning the woods that bordered the road. And that's when I heard it, a noise. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe the creaking of the trees, but then it came again, louder this time. A crunch of leaves underfoot, something or someone moving in the woods. I froze, the jacket still clutched in my hand, my heart thudding in my chest like a war drum. I could feel the sweat creeping down my back, even though the air was cold. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know. Another crunch, this time from the other side of the road. I turned but saw nothing. The trees were silent now, dark shapes against the sky, but they hid whatever was lurking within. I turned back to my truck, but before I could make it to the door, the scream came. It was high-pitched, frantic, a child's scream, so sharp, so full of terror that it sent a jolt of electricity through my body. My stomach dropped, and for a moment I didn't know what to do. Should I go toward the sound? Should I run? Another scream. This one was different. A man's scream, or something pretending to be a man. I was paralyzed for a second, but then I snapped out of it. I had to do something. I scrambled back into the truck and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, but I was moving now, pulling forward, aiming the headlights toward the woods. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. There, in the shadows between the trees, a group of figures. People, I realized with a jolt. At first I thought they were lost hikers or some sort of crazy hillbillies. But as my headlights cut through the darkness, I saw it, the one thing I hadn't expected. They were holding something, a speaker, and they were mimicking the sounds of children, the screams, the crying, all of it. For a moment I thought I was going crazy. My hands clenched the wheel as the blood rushed to my ears, the horror of it sinking in. These people had been pretending to be children, luring unsuspecting drivers into the woods. I don't know what their end game was, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. But before I could even speak, before I could ask for help, someone threw something at my truck. A rock, I think. It hit the passenger window with a loud crack, sending shards of glass flying into the cab. I slammed my foot on the gas. The engine roared and the truck lurched forward, tires screeching as I sped down the road, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know who those people were or what they were trying to do, but it didn't matter. I drove for hours, not stopping until the morning light finally broke over the horizon. I've been on this road long enough to know that some things stay with you. Some things are just a little too wrong. And whatever those people were up to, I don't think I'll ever really know. But I learned something that night. Something that still haunts me. The road might seem endless. The woods might seem empty. But there are things hiding in the dark. Things that you don't want to find. Things that you can't unsee. And the worst part is, they're out there, waiting. I've been a trucker for more years than I care to count. And while the road's a straight shot from A to B, there's a whole lot of time between those 2 points. Time to think. Time to sink into the isolation that gnaws at the edges of your sanity, like some invisible thing lurking just outside your windshield. The kind of isolation that you can almost taste, like the metal tang of stale coffee, or the way the air feels after a storm, heavy and pressing down on you. Sometimes the loneliness eats at you slowly, like the quiet rasp of a nail on wood. And other times, it hits all at once, like the truck's brakes suddenly slamming down. It was about 3 months into this whole game that I felt it start to take hold. The weariness in my bones, the sense that something in the universe was off. But you can't just stop. Not when you're miles away from the nearest motel, and the only company you've got is your own thoughts, which are beginning to feel less like company and more like an enemy. I was on a 12-hour stretch from southern New Jersey, headed to Lafayette, Indiana. The route was familiar, the kind of trip that didn't demand too much of your attention. The miles just rolled by, monotonous and endless. Around the time I hit the Pennsylvania border, I figured I'd push through the night. I'd been doing okay without sleep, relying on the dull hum of the engine and the radio static to keep me going. I didn't care about the time, I just wanted to get there. But then about 20 miles outside of Harrisburg, it hit me like a sucker punch right to the gut. I'd forgotten to restock the truck with energy drinks. The canisters, the lifeblood of long-haul truckers, were all but gone. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I cursed under my breath. Now I could have just kept going, pushed the truck through on fumes. But no, it was one of those nights where you know you've got to stop. So I pulled off the highway at the first service stop I could find. It wasn't much to look at. The sign was half faded, the neon flickering weakly, but I was too tired to care. The truck rolled into the lot, and I slid out, the night air wrapping around me in that odd, almost suffocating silence that you only get when you're in the middle of nowhere. The lot was empty. No other vehicles, no lights shining from the windows of the store, just darkness and the soft hum of the fluorescent bulbs inside the convenience store. And even those seemed about to burn out. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaked louder than I expected, and I stepped into the store, expecting to find a few tired souls filling up their thermos, or maybe a late-night worker running the register. But there was nothing, just shadows and dust. The store seemed abandoned, which struck me as odd, considering it was open. But the strangest part wasn't the absence of people, it was the complete, oppressive silence. The kind that presses on your ears until you feel like they might start bleeding. I squinted into the dimness. In the back, a faint glow caught my eye, a pale light barely cutting through the dark. I moved toward it, my boots scraping on the dirty tile floor. And that's when I saw it, the refrigerator. Old, rusting, humming like it had seen better days, but it was plugged in. And that gave me some strange comfort. The dull light reflected off the glass door, and I grabbed the handle. When I opened it, though, I froze. Nothing. Just an empty, gutted shell. There wasn't a single can or bottle inside. The shelves were bare, like someone had come in and ripped everything out, leaving nothing but cold metal and dark emptiness. My heart beat faster. Maybe it was a joke, some kind of weird prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something beyond just a missing drink. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a noise from the back room, faint but clear, something dragging or maybe footsteps. I froze in place, straining to listen, my senses sharp as needles. Was I imagining it? It had to be nothing. But I didn't move, didn't dare. For a moment, I thought I might have just caught the wind in the vents or something. But the dragging sound came again, slow, deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't decide if I should investigate or get the hell out of there. My gut twisted with unease. I didn't investigate. Instead, I bolted. I rushed to the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But when I got outside and slammed the door behind me, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The door. It was wide open. I had definitely closed it behind me. I remember that for sure. My mind raced, fighting the panic that was beginning to creep in. But I didn't want to stick around to find out what was going on. I got back in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. But something about that place, it didn't sit right. It sat like a stone in the pit of my stomach, and I couldn't shake it off. I hit the highway again, my hands gripped tight on the wheel, the engine roaring beneath me like a wild animal. The road stretched out ahead, endless and dark. But then something caught my eye, a flicker in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the fatigue, messing with my mind. But no, the curtain in the back of my truck was moving. I could see it shifting, even though there was no wind. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Something, or someone, was back there. I couldn't make out any details, but my brain screamed at me to be careful, to get the hell off the road and find somewhere safe. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a bag had shifted, but then I saw it again. The movement. The panic came like a flood. I thought of every horror movie I'd ever seen, every story about hitchhikers or drifters hiding in the back of trucks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The minutes felt like hours as I gripped the wheel, trying to force myself to calm down, but it was like the truck was getting heavier, the air thicker. I could feel the presence back there, watching me, waiting. When I finally reached a small police station, I didn't even stop to think. I just barreled through the doors, my truck still running outside, and I grabbed the first officer I saw. My words were a mess, but somehow they understood. They came out to the truck, guns drawn, and before I knew it, they were pulling out 3 people from the back of my rig. They looked like they hadn't seen a shower or a decent meal in months. 2 men, ragged and dirty, their eyes wide and wild, and a woman huddled in a corner, her face pale and blank. They didn't say a word, just stared at me with that unsettling, blank stare, like they knew something I didn't. I watched as they were arrested, my skin crawling with the strange feeling that this was all some kind of twisted joke. But there was nothing funny about it. I still don't know who they were or what they were doing in my truck. The police never told me, but I haven't forgotten their eyes, and I haven't forgotten the cold chill that crawled up my spine as they were driven away. Now, every time I get behind the wheel, that feeling comes back, the one that tells you someone is watching, that they're closer than you think, just waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe on the road again, but I can't stop. I've got nowhere else to go.